Welcome, everybody. We are here in the laboratory for X-ray imaging of the Max Planck Institute, and I'm Peter Fratzl, and I'd like to make a few comments about natural active materials. So what do we understand with material activity, at least from an engineering point of view? I would start with some comments about responsiveness and then put this into the context of design, structure, and properties. And then some additional comments about adaptivity and discuss this in the framework of growth and also the emergence of structure. Sometimes all across the talk, you will see this sign, and this sign means that you can find additional information in the room later after the talk. So what do we understand when under the concept of responsive materials? So first, a material itself. Now, a material is something where you have an input and an output, and the relation between input and output is the material property. So for example, you apply a voltage and you get out some current, and then the property that relates to two is the resistivity. Now, what defines responsiveness? The responsiveness is a modification of the material property due to a signal from outside. So for example, if I have this tap here and I start to turn, then I can reduce the flow of water. And this reduction of the flow of water is achieved by the property, which is just the size of the tube that allows the water to go through. I mean, this is a very simple example of a device. Here is another example with a resistivity. The resistivity transforms a voltage into a current, and typically resistivities are temperature dependent. So if I'm increasing the temperature, I'm increasing the resistivity, and therefore the relation between voltage and current is changing. So this is a response of the material to some outside signal. Similar responsiveness exists in biogenic materials, and the examples shown here are the awns of the wheat and of some other grasses. And you see that we have different types of movement, the transformation of a stick into a spiral or a swimming movement. And all this movement is just due to an interaction with the environment and notably with the humidity of the air that surrounds the grass. And how is this converted into this movement? It's converted by an internal architecture of, in this case, cellulose fibrils that are in these awns and that allow this conversion of water absorption to a specific movement. In architecture, so these are some examples from Achim Menges in Stuttgart. In architecture, some of these ideas are already being used and converted to facade elements that change their state, that open and close depending on environmental conditions. How can we understand this in terms of structure? Wood is a hierarchically structured material from the scale of centimeters that defines, for example, the diameter of the stem, down to smaller scales where you can see individual fibers, individual cells, hollow tubes basically, that have different shapes, different sizes, different arrangements. And then finally, these tubes themselves, all the way down here, are built by cellulose fibrils very, very thin fibers. An example of one of the structure of such a fiber is shown here. Very thin fibers and that are arranged in a helical fashion around the tube of the cell. But the helix pitch, or the angle of the cellulose with the cell, is actually changing and adapted to the needs. So this is what's defining the responsiveness of the material. A more extreme example is given here. And if you want to know more about these Banksia seed pods, you can look up, as I said before, later in our laboratory room and find Michaela, who is going to give some more information on those. Now, these seeds are living in a fire ecology. So bushfires have existed forever, and we hear about them from Australia or California. And some plants have adapted to these bushfires, so that when one of these fires is coming, of course, there will be high temperatures developed. This will generate an initial crack in these seeds, so they will start to open, and then they wait for the rain, and as the rain following the fire, the seed pods will open completely. And of course, this is the best moment to set the sheets when all the competitors are burned and the earth is prepared for growth. Yeah. So, as I said, more information about these refer to Michaela. What does this mean now in a more abstract sense? A robotic arm is as used, for example, in the manufacturing of cars, is something that can perform a variety of mechanical tasks. And the tasks are performed by the movement of motors around certain joint-like structures. And the information for the movement is brought by a cable, namely from a computer that tells the robotic arm by how much each of the motors should be moved in order to perform the desired movement. And a second cable is required that brings the energy for the movement. The OWN that transforms from a stick to a spiral that we've seen just before does not have any of these two cables. And the reason is that the information concerning the deformation, concerning the shape change, are already built into the material in the form of the cellulose fiber arrangement. And the energy that is required for the movement is taken from the surrounding air, which changes in humidity. And this brings me to the last image on this slide here. And this is from a textbook from the 19th century, from the Technische Hochschule Charlottenburg, the actual TU Berlin, from Fratzl. And it shows two machine elements. And if you ask the question, how does the wheel on the left know in which direction to turn, knowing that the wheel on the right turns clockwise, then this information is not transmitted through a sensor, a computer, and some cables. It is transmitted directly by the geometric arrangement between the two wheels. So it can be either in the same direction or in opposite directions, depending on the mechanical interaction. So it means that in this case, the information is stored in the analog and not in the digital, namely in the mechanical structure of the elements. And this makes it actually fairly close to this kind of motor that is also changing shape, this kind of object, let's say, that's changing shape, depending on air humidity, and the information for it is deposited in the form of structure inside. Again, a step further to make this even more general as a comment. So let's take at engineering material, and let's look at the three components, namely information, energy, and material. So obviously, the robotic arm has its own materiality. It's made of steel, maybe aluminum or something like that. And as we said before, the two cables bring in energy and information. So the system relies on outside sources for these two things. The active material, on the other hand, is not relying necessarily on this. Of course, it also has a materiality. So the wheat owns are made of a cellulose-based material, but the information is stored in the material in the form of cellulose architecture, and the energy can also be stored inside the material. For example, in the form of internal stresses. There can also be chemical reactants waiting for a reaction to take place, or the energy can be directly taken from the environment without a cable from the humidity of the air. So the activity is a combination of materiality, energy, and information in the same object. Here are just a few examples from natural systems to give you a sense on how versatile nature is using this principle. So this is from a spider claw, and all insect and arthropod cuticles are made of one and the same material, namely chitin fibers that are wrapped with some protein. So it's always the same kind of material that you find on spiders, flies, and lots of other insect arthropods, including, for example, shrimp and marine animals of that nature. But the important thing is that these fibers, they vary in size, in spacing, in orientation, and this variation in all these parameters completely changes their behavior and their properties. So that the claws of the spider, the antenna of the insect, and the tendon with which some limbs are being moved, they're maybe all made of chitin, but they have extremely different behavior because they are made because they have very different internal structure. So the internal structure is coding the responsiveness of this material. And here is another example that is like the fibers of great interest to the cluster matters of activity, in particular in the project material form function. So these are tessellated materials built of tiles. So many natural systems are built like this. And of course, you all know paved roads that are made of tiles. And the properties of these tessellated materials are to a large extent defined by the way the tiles are shaped and arranged with respect to each other. So as you see here in these examples from nature, and here in these more schematic representations. So just think about the paved road. If the earth is swelling because it has to absorb water in winter, then of course a paved road is able to change shape. And it's able to change shape not because the stone is deforming, but because the interstices allow this movement. Now let's quickly look at the implications of this for understanding how to deal with bio-based materials. So first, start from a tree. Now, a tree, we said before, has a hierarchical structure, is made of lots of complexity. And for the technical use of wood, typically we are reducing the complexity to use, for example, wooden beams or plywood arrangements or cardboards, paper, and even at the end, molecules that you can turn into fuels. This is very different from what we do in engineering very often, where we can start from the oil that is taken out of the earth, and then using chemical processes transformed into polymers, into plastics, into various components, and at the end into a system. And you see, if we want to do this similarly with bio-based materials, of course we can go reduce all the complexity to almost nothing, and then increase the complexity again by using lots of energy to go back to the part, to the system that we want. Now the question that arises from this is, to which extent can we actually use some of the pre-existing information inside the material wood in order to use it directly, whether it's at this level or a level further down, to use it directly in applications. So this is something that we are certainly very keen to understand a little better. Here is an example of collaboration with the Kunsthochschule Weißensee, which I personally find extremely exciting and rewarding, where some of these structural principles from nature are converted into artifacts made by the students of that university. So we had already three courses linked to this, 3 generations of students that were producing incredible artifacts based on some of the information they received from these natural systems. So I think this is a fantastic example on what kind of collaboration this cluster is able to achieve. Now, let me come to the second part and make a few comments about adaptivity. So adaptivity is going a little further than responsivity. So just to remind you, the responsiveness is the reaction, the change in material properties due to an outside stimulus. Now, if it's not an outside stimulus, but if the signal, the stimulus comes from the material itself, then suddenly you get a feedback loop. And this feedback loop allows for training, for adaptation, for a change of the material property to be best suited for the kind of conversion to the kind of external interaction needed. So in order to make this a little more concrete, in terms of an example, let's look at the example of a growing tree. So a little tree that's growing needs to get up to some height very quickly, because it needs to have light for the leaves in order to be able to survive. And this has a difficult consequence for the tree. Its trunk must be very long but still thin, because there was no time to grow it thicker. So this kind of object can easily be broken. And flexibility is what is required in this particular case. While later, when the tree is grown and there is the heavy weight of the crown, flexibility is not good because the tree would bend over. Rather, stiffness is needed. So this tree needs different internal properties at different moments in its own life. And not surprisingly, what the tree is able to do, it's able to grow materials with a large fiber angle in the beginning, shown here in this graph, that is then decreased gradually and turns into a material with very high stiffness later in time. So adaptive growth is the procedure by which this plant is able to acquire the optimal properties as a function of time. Another example, even more striking, you have in your own bodies, in your skeleton. This is bone. And bone, it was recognized very early on that bone, here is the example of a hip, for example, has internal structures reminiscent of Gothic cathedrals, but also of buildings, steel buildings of the 19th century, as was recognized by these Swiss engineers in the 19th century. But even more interesting is the observation by Julius Wolf from the Charité hospital in Berlin, who discovered that when after a fracture, a bone is healing in a wrong position, for example, with an angle between the two parts, something we really don't want. But surprisingly, even under these circumstances, the bone's internal structure changes gradually and adapts as much as possible to this unusual situation. So there is something in this material that allows it to adapt. And responsible for this are for this specific remodeling are cells that we can see here. Some cells that are growing bone, some cells that are removing bone, and some cells that are measuring the mechanical stimulus. So how is this working? Very briefly, it is working by a feedback loop that you have schematically shown here. The feedback loop consists in measuring the force and then converting the force into additional growth of bone if the force is lower, so that if you play tennis with your right arm, you're going to have a stronger bone on the right side. And of course, this can be sort of reenacted by theoretical models, for example. Of course, this raises the question, how is it possible to actually measure stresses and estimate them? It turns out that one of the probable systems is a system of very fine channels in bone where a fluid is flowing when pressure is applied. And here are some data, some measurements of these networks, these cell networks in bone. And remember that you're here in an imaging, X-ray imaging lab. We have also similar labs for three-dimensional electron imaging. And of course, it's imaging of this nature here, where we can see tiny fibers, where we can see the channels between the fibers, where we can see mineral precursors brought along. So here you can see how bone is actually forming and how the different components are brought about. And it requires a highly complex system of channels that are shown in a still here, and where here you see serial sections, some bigger channels, some smaller channels that serve for the transport. So this brings me to the last part, last few comments here. So this image you've seen, the loss and the increase of complexity, and in particular, we can think that the tree has been grown by adaptive growth, as just shown. And now, how is this complexity generated? There's no good answer for this at all, and I think that's a big research topic in general. But let me just give you one example that shows that complexity can emerge from very, very simple principles. And behind me, what you're seeing is air bubbles, soap bubbles filled with air. And the properties of the soap bubbles is that they have only a surface, and actually they would like to minimize the surface. And that leads to shapes that have constant curvature. And then, of course, the simplest example is a sphere. So why are they much more complex than a sphere? Because they adhere to branches in that particular case. So the boundary conditions generate complexity in a system that is extremely simple to start with. Surprisingly, the same thing is true for the growth of tissues here. And you see a fairly complex tissue shapes here, and here are some further examples. And we can actually recognize that surface tension is generating this complex structures. It's even possible to show physically that there is surface tension, because cells, and this is represented here in these nice images, cells are actively pulling to generate the surface tension. So the green color is the tension generated by cells in the form of actin filaments, and you see that they're completely located in the surface of the tissue. Now, what does this all mean for both biology and bio-inspired design? So this here is a sort of theoretical discussion of the complexity that can arise from a very simple model of tissue growth that's governed by surface tension only. And all these shapes here on this slide, and there's a kind of a variety of shapes, they all have the same property, that they have constant curvature, they have the minimal possible surface. And the differences are just due to the different adherence to, for example, this cylindrical structure that serves as a boundary condition. And actually, just imagine this cylindrical structure, a piece of broken bone, and all these shapes, tissues grown on the surface of this. So the message here is that the complexity is not in the physical model, it is not in the tissue itself. The complexity actually arose of these shapes from the interaction with a complex environment. And so a one-parameter model with only surface tension can give rise to a multitude of shapes just by varying the boundary conditions. And of course, that has interesting consequences. And in particular, it has consequences for understanding how complexity arises in biology. And of course, we don't really understand this yet, but it also raises into interesting question for bio-inspired design. I mean, at the end, all you need to prescribe is a single parameter, and then the complexity of the shapes come about by the interaction with the complexity of the world around the growing tissue. So that brings me to the end and to a conclusion. So I think you've seen that I commented about responsiveness and how that relates to structure and design. And then I introduced the concept of adaptivity and how that is related to growth and to the emergence of structure. And finally, if you have time after the talk, don't forget to look around in our laboratory room and to get a few more informations on selected aspects of all this. Thank you very much.